The story doesn't begin with a war, but with a treaty designed to prevent one. The 28th of June, 1919. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing restrictions on German military development. No tanks, no military aircraft, severe limitations on artillery. The Allied powers were determined that Germany would never again possess the weapons that had devastated Europe for 4 long years. But there was a loophole. Chemical weapons had horrified the entire world during World War I. Mustard gas, chlorine, phosgene, these instruments of death had killed and maimed hundreds of thousands of men. The treaty restricted offensive chemical weapons, but it said absolutely nothing about defensive smoke-generating equipment. German military planners saw their opportunity. In the 1,920 seconds, they began developing what they called Nebelwerfer, smoke mortars, ostensibly designed to deploy defensive smoke screens to conceal troop movements. Technically, these were permitted under the treaty. Special units called Nebeltruppen, literally smoke troops, were formed, operating under the innocuous-sounding Nebel branch, which simply means smoke. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The deception was brilliant. While Allied inspectors nodded approvingly at Germany's defensive smoke generators, German engineers were designing something far more sinister. A multi-barrel rocket launcher capable of delivering devastating barrages of powerful explosives. The key figure was Richard Fiedler, though the development involved numerous engineers at the German Army Weapons Office. Unlike traditional artillery that used propellant charges in a gun barrel, rockets carried their own propulsion. This meant lighter launchers, no massive recoil to manage, and the ability to fire multiple projectiles rapidly. By the early 1,930 seconds, under the cover of smoke research, German engineers had developed solid-fuel rocket technology sophisticated enough for military applications. The rockets used diglycol powder as propellant, which burned efficiently and produced significant thrust. The first true Nebelwerfer, the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41, was officially introduced in 1941, though development had been ongoing since the mid-1930 seconds. It featured 6 launch tubes arranged in a circular pattern on a modified 37 mm anti-tank gun carriage. The system could be towed by light vehicles or even manhandled by its crew. The specifications were impressive. 6 150 mm rockets. Each rocket weighed approximately 75 pounds, or 34 kilograms. The total weight, including explosives, was about 6.5 pounds per rocket. Maximum range reached 7,300 yards, or 6,700 meters. The rate of fire allowed all 6 rockets to be launched in just 10 seconds. Reload time with a trained crew was approximately 90 seconds, but the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is what happened when these rockets flew through the air. It wasn't simply a question of explosive weight or maximum range. It was something much deeper, something that touched the very essence of psychological warfare. German engineers had discovered something that few weapons designers had fully understood before. Terror could be as powerful a weapon as steel and explosives. And this terror could be designed, manufactured, perfected with the same precision as a sighting mechanism or propulsion system. In secret laboratories scattered across Germany, far from the eyes of Allied inspectors, engineers tested not only ballistics and explosive power, but also acoustics. They experimented with different exhaust nozzle configurations, different arrangements of ventilation holes, searching for the perfect sound, the sound that could break a soldier's morale before the explosive even touched the ground. What they were creating wasn't simply a weapon. It was an instrument of psychological terror disguised as defensive, smoke equipment. The first tests were conducted in the greatest secrecy. Rockets were launched in isolated areas, far from civilian populations, far from foreign observers. Engineers took meticulous notes. Which nozzle configuration produced the most terrifying scream? Which tube arrangement created the most destabilizing barrage? How to maximize not only physical damage but also psychological impact. Year after year, throughout the 1,930 seconds, the Nebelwerfer evolved. Each iteration was more effective than the last. The rockets flew farther, hit harder, and above all, screamed louder. This distinctive scream, this rising cry that resembled 1,000 banshees descending from the heavens, was not an accident of design. It was an intentional feature, carefully calibrated. By 1941, when the Nebelwerfer 41 was officially introduced, Germany possessed a weapon that would redefine rocket warfare. On paper, it was a relatively simple multi-barrel rocket launcher. In battlefield reality, it was a mind-breaking machine. The modified carriage allowed rapid mobility. Crews could position the launcher, fire their 6 rockets in such a short time that the enemy had no time to react, then disappear before counter-battery artillery could calculate their position. This shoot-and-scoot tactic would become the signature of Nebelwerfer units. But no one, not the German engineers, not the military planners, and certainly not the Allied soldiers who would soon face this weapon, could fully anticipate the psychological impact the Nebelwerfer would have on World War II battlefields. The Treaty of Versailles had been designed to disarm Germany. Instead, it had created perfect conditions for clandestine innovation. Restriction had bred creativity. Prohibition had given birth to deception. And this deception had produced one of the war's most terrifying weapons. In the years to come, millions of soldiers, Soviet, American, British, would hear that characteristic scream and know that hell itself was about to descend upon them. This is where the Nebelwerfer becomes truly fascinating and truly horrifying. The piercing scream that gave the weapon its Allied nicknames was not an accident. It was designed, calculated, perfected. Each rocket had 26 Venturi holes, nozzles arranged in a ring around the base. These orifices were not optimally designed for propulsion efficiency. They were designed to produce noise. As the rocket flew, expanding gases screamed through these holes at specific frequencies that human ears find particularly disturbing, almost unbearable. The sound has been described by veterans as a rising banshee wail, like a freight train falling from the sky, the devil's own scream, and worse than anything you can imagine. An American veteran, interviewed decades later, said with a voice that still trembled at the memory, "You could hear them coming for what felt like an eternity. That scream entered your head and refused to leave. We had guys who panicked and ran the moment they heard it, even before the rockets hit. You couldn't help it. Your body wanted to flee before your brain could tell you there was nowhere to go." This was psychological warfare in its most effective, most brutal form. The terror began the very moment the rockets were launched, a full 20 to 30 seconds before impact. Those seconds felt like endless hours. Imagine that moment. You're in a frozen trench, somewhere on the Eastern Front. The ground is hard as stone, your hands are numb from the cold. Then you hear it, that rising scream, that cry unlike anything else on Earth. You know what's coming. You know that somewhere, miles away, 6 rockets have just been launched. And for the next 30 seconds, all you can do is wait and listen to that scream growing louder and louder, closer and closer. 30 seconds to contemplate your own mortality. 30 seconds where every fibre of your being screams to run, even though your training tells you to stay covered. 30 seconds of pure psychological hell. Let's talk about what 6 rockets in 10 seconds actually means on the battlefield. Traditional artillery fired shells sequentially. A battery could fire multiple guns, but each gun had to reload between shots. The rate of fire was limited by mechanical constraints: opening the breech, loading the shell, closing the breech, aiming, firing. The process took time, precious seconds that added up. The Nebelwerfer bypassed all of that with elegant and deadly simplicity. 6 rockets sat ready in their tubes, prepared, loaded. Pull the trigger actually, turn an electrical firing handle, and all 6 launched in rapid succession. Boom, 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 boom. 10 seconds. Done. The impact pattern was devastating by design. Because the tubes were arranged in a circle and fired in sequence, the rockets would impact in a roughly circular pattern, saturating an area approximately 100 yards in diameter. Everything in that circle was subjected to a triple deadly threat: high explosive fragmentation, concussive overpressure that could crush lungs, and psychological shock that broke the will to fight. A single Nebelwerfer battery, typically 3 launchers operating in coordination, could place 18 rockets into a target area in less than 15 seconds. That's over 1,300 pounds of powerful explosives delivered faster than a defender could react or even understand what was happening. Compare that to conventional artillery. An artillery battery might fire perhaps 6 shells in 15 seconds if the crew was exceptionally well trained. The Nebelwerfer delivered 3 times that number with a minimal crew and equipment that cost a fraction of the price of a traditional artillery piece. The Nebelwerfer saw intense combat first on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces, though exact dates of first use are difficult to determine precisely in the chaos of that massive war. Soviet troops, who had already endured Stuka dive bombers and massive artillery barrages, found the Nebelwerfer particularly demoralizing. The sound was different from anything they had encountered. Katyusha rockets, the Soviet equivalent, made noise, certainly, but nothing comparable to the Nebelwerfer's distinctive scream. German tactical doctrine required that Nebelwerfer batteries be used in 4 main roles. First, saturation bombardment of enemy positions before infantry assault, breaking defenses and morale before soldiers advanced. Second, rapid-fire harassment to disrupt enemy movement and morale, sudden and unpredictable salvos that kept the enemy off balance. Third, counter-battery fire against enemy artillery positions, silencing guns before they could respond. Fourth, defensive fire to break up enemy attacks, transforming an advance into a panicked retreat. The weapon proved particularly effective in urban warfare. At Stalingrad, that apocalyptic battle that lasted months and cost millions of lives, Nebelwerfer batteries could saturate an entire city block in seconds. Buildings collapsed, defenders were buried under rubble, and the psychological impact in the confined urban terrain was amplified. Terrifyingly, the scream echoed off buildings, seeming to come from everywhere at once. Soviet soldiers reported that the sound in the ruins of Stalingrad was particularly nightmarish. Echoes reverberated between broken concrete walls, creating a disorienting cacophony. You couldn't tell where the rockets were coming from. You couldn't predict where they would hit. You could only wait, listen to that infernal scream, and pray. German commanders perfectly understood the value of this weapon. In after-action reports, they noted again and again that the Nebelwerfer's effect went far beyond simple physical casualties. Troops who had survived a Nebelwerfer barrage were often psychologically broken, unable to function effectively for hours, sometimes days. The success of the 15 cm Nebelwerfer 41 led to rapid development of variants, each designed for a specific role on the constantly evolving battlefield. This version represented a significant escalation in firepower. 5 tubes instead of 6, but make no mistake, this was an improvement, not a reduction. The rockets were much heavier, 248 pounds each, more than 3 times the weight of the 15 cm model. Range was slightly reduced to 8,200 yards, but the devastating explosive charge more than compensated. 22 pounds of powerful explosive per rocket. The impact of a single 21 cm rocket was compared to that of a 150 mm artillery shell, standard heavy artillery. Imagine 5 of those impacts arriving almost simultaneously in a concentrated area. Fortifications that could withstand conventional artillery bombardment disintegrated under this concentrated firepower. This variant represented a radically different approach. Instead of reusable metal tubes, it used wooden launch frames. Why wood? Because these launchers were designed to be disposable, single-use. They could fire either 280 mm rockets or 320 mm monsters. These weapons were primarily used for urban warfare and fortification destruction. The 32 cm rocket carried over 100 pounds of explosive, enough to demolish entire buildings, to create breaches in fortification walls that conventional artillery could only scratch. The wooden frames were inexpensive to manufacture and easy to transport. Once used, they were simply abandoned. War economics at its most brutal and pragmatic. The 6-tube version was an attempt to combine the rate of fire of the original 15 cm model with the destructive power of the heavier calibers. Each rocket weighed 277 pounds. Range was shorter, but the explosive charge was enormous. This weapon was used primarily for siege warfare and static positions, situations where range mattered less than pure demolition capability. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 6 of these rockets, launched in 10 seconds, could transform a fortified district into smoking rubble. Defenders had literally no chance of survival in structures hit by this deluge of fire. Perhaps the most spectacular evolution was the heavy rocket launcher, mounted on an armoured half-track chassis, the Panzerwerfer 42. This innovation combined the mobility of an armoured vehicle with the firepower of the Nebelwerfer, creating something truly formidable. The vehicle could drive to a firing position, launch 10 rockets from its armoured launcher, then immediately retreat before counter-battery fire arrived. The Panzerwerfer typically carried 20 rockets, 10 inches the launcher, 10 reloads inside the vehicle. A skilled crew could fire 10 rockets, reload, and fire 10 more in under 5 minutes. This meant a single vehicle could deliver the equivalent of 2 traditional Nebelwerfer batteries, then disappear before the enemy could react effectively. The armour protected the crew against shell fragments and small arms fire. The half-track's engine allowed rapid repositioning. The combination was devastating, massive firepower with considerably improved survivability compared to towed static launchers. Panzerwerfer crews developed sophisticated tactics. They would approach enemy positions under cover of darkness, hide in prepared positions, wait for the optimal moment, then unleash their barrage and disappear into the landscape before shocked defenders could even identify where the attack came from. When Allied forces first encountered Nebelwerfers in North Africa and Italy, the psychological impact was immediate and severe. A report from an American officer in Italy in 1944 perfectly captures the reality. The men call them screaming memes, and I've never seen anything affect morale this way. We've endured sustained artillery fire with less psychological impact than a single Nebelwerfer salvo. The sound is indescribable, and the men's reactions are almost involuntary. Training and discipline help, but I've seen veterans with years of combat experience diving for cover the moment they hear that sound. British forces in Normandy encountered Nebelwerfer batteries dug in around fortified positions. The combination of machine guns, mortars, artillery, and Nebelwerfers created defensive fire so intense that entire companies would go to ground and refuse to advance until air support or heavy artillery could suppress the rocket positions. Allied commanders were frustrated. Their troops, hardened soldiers who had survived countless battles, were paralyzed by the mere sound of these rockets. This wasn't cowardice. It was a visceral human reaction to something that touched the most primitive fears. The scream activated survival instincts that military training couldn't completely suppress. From an engineering perspective, the Nebelwerfer represented interesting compromises that reveal much about German weapons design philosophy during the war. The launcher was remarkably light, only 1,100 pounds. This meant it could be towed by any vehicle or even manually handled by its crew if necessary. This flexibility was invaluable in fluid combat conditions. The rate of fire was extremely high. 6 rockets in 10 seconds represented a concentration of firepower that few weapons could match. The electrical firing system was simple, reliable, robust. Minimal maintenance was required, crucial in difficult field conditions, where spare parts and skilled technicians were scarce. The devastating psychological impact was, of course, a major advantage, and effectiveness against area targets, trenches, troop concentrations, fortified positions was exceptional. But every weapon has its weaknesses, and the Nebelwerfer was no exception. The smoke signature was highly visible. The moment a Nebelwerfer fired, it produced enormous clouds of white smoke visible for miles around. This smoke literally screamed, "We are here," to every enemy artilleryman within. a radius of several kilometers. The loud launch sound, distinct from the rocket's scream, also compromised concealment. Accuracy was limited compared to rifled artillery. Rockets followed ballistic trajectories but without the spin stabilization of conventional artillery shells. This made them excellent for saturating an area but less effective against precise point targets. Range was relatively short. Even the longer-range models couldn't compete with heavy conventional artillery. This put crews in a zone vulnerable to enemy counter-battery fire. And the long reload time, about 90 seconds, with a trained crew made them vulnerable. German military doctrine therefore required shoot and scoot tactics. Fire a salvo, then move to alternate positions within 2 minutes before enemy artillery could calculate the firing position and respond. This smoke signature was particularly problematic under modern combat conditions, where counter-battery radar and aerial reconnaissance made each shot potentially lethal for the crew. Nebelwerfer crews lived by a simple principle: mobility equals survival. Remaining static meant death. Faced with the terror of the Nebelwerfer, Allied forces had to innovate rapidly. Survival depended on the ability to neutralize this weapon before it completely broke troop morale. By 1944, Allied forces had deployed sophisticated radar systems capable of tracking the ballistic arc of Nebelwerfer rockets and calculating their point of origin with remarkable precision. These systems represented a major technological advance in modern warfare. Artillery batteries would receive firing coordinates within minutes of a Nebelwerfer launch. This technology transformed the Nebelwerfer's tactical advantage into a deadly trap. German crews who took too long to relocate found themselves under a deluge of 155mm artillery shells. The hunter became the hunted. Radar operators learned to distinguish the distinctive ballistic signature of Nebelwerfer rockets. The trajectory was different from conventional artillery shells, more arched, less stable. This unique signature allowed rapid identification and near-immediate response. Allied air dominance by 1944 made Nebelwerfer positions extremely vulnerable. The distinctive smoke clouds, those enormous white plumes that erupted at the moment of firing, were visible to aircraft miles away. It was like lighting a giant smoke signal saying, "Attack me here." British Typhoon and American Thunderbolt fighter bombers would strafe suspected launch sites immediately after detecting fire. Pilots learned to recognize the characteristic white signature and would dive to attack before ground crews could withdraw. 60-pound rockets and 20mm cannons transformed Nebelwerfer positions into smoking craters. German crews lived in constant terror of Allied aviation. Even in overcast weather, they knew aircraft could break through the clouds at any moment. The simple act of firing their weapon marked them for death. The best countermeasure was paradoxically the most counterintuitive: aggressive infantry advance. The weapons were devastating against static positions, but considerably less effective against troops in rapid movement. Allied forces learned a difficult and unnatural lesson. They used Nebelwerfer fire as a signal to advance rather than take cover. The moment that characteristic scream began, instead of diving into trenches, they ran forward, moving into the beaten zone before crews could reload. It was terrifying. Every instinct screamed to seek shelter. But commanders who enforced this tactic discovered it worked. Troops in movement presented difficult targets for rockets with fixed ballistic trajectories. And in 90 seconds, the reload time infantry could cover significant distance, sometimes even reaching the Nebelwerfer positions themselves. Training programs evolved to specifically address the Nebelwerfer's psychological impact. It was no longer enough to train soldiers in conventional combat. They had to be psychologically prepared to face this unique weapon. Veterans described the sound to new recruits with visceral details. They explained that the scream meant the rockets were still in flight. You were still alive if you could hear it. "If you hear it screaming, you're safe," instructors would say. "If you can't hear it anymore, well, you probably won't be conscious to worry about it." This familiarization helped. Nothing could completely prepare a man for that sound, but enough so soldiers didn't panic instantly. Knowing what was going to happen, understanding that the sound itself couldn't kill you, made the difference between a unit that disintegrates and one that maintains cohesion under fire. Nebelwerfer batteries provided crucial fire support during Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. This titanic battle, involving millions of men and thousands of tanks, would see the Nebelwerfer play a significant role. Soviet forces reported that Nebelwerfer barrages were more demoralizing than traditional artillery because of the speed and intensity of the bombardment. Soviet defensive positions, prepared with weeks of earthwork, were saturated in seconds. The scream echoed across the steppes, a sound that Soviet soldiers learned to fear more than the Stukas themselves. German forces defending the historic monastery used Nebelwerfers extensively against Allied positions in one of the Italian campaign's fiercest battles. The weapon proved ideal for the rugged mountainous terrain. Rockets could be launched from concealed positions in deep valleys and impact on Allied positions on summits where traditional artillery had difficulty reaching with precision. The Allies painfully climbed steep slopes, only to be greeted by Nebelwerfer barrages that transformed their hard-won positions into hell. The caves and ravines of the Italian mountains amplified the scream, creating multiple echoes that completely disoriented. Soldiers reported being unable to determine where the rockets were coming from. The sound seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously. During the defense against Allied invasion, Nebelwerfer batteries played key roles in several critical engagements along the beaches and in the Norman bocage. At Carentan, American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division reported that Nebelwerfer fire was more psychologically damaging than the heavier artillery bombardments they had endured. These men had survived chaotic night jumps, house-to-house fighting, tank attacks. But the Nebelwerfer reached them in a different way. The Norman bocage, with its thick hedgerows and narrow fields, created a particular acoustic environment. The scream echoed between the ancient hedges, seeming to come from multiple directions. Troops trapped in these green labyrinths lived in constant terror of the next barrage. Germany's last major offensive in the West, the desperate operation known as the Battle of the Bulge, saw intensive and strategic use of Nebelwerfers. The weapons were particularly effective in the dense Ardennes forests. The scream echoed among snow-covered trees, creating a surreal and terrifying effect. The thick snow absorbed some of the metal fragmentation but, paradoxically, amplified the psychological impact. The muffled silence of the winter forest was torn apart by this inhuman cry. American soldiers, many inexperienced and poorly equipped for winter combat, found the Nebelwerfer particularly demoralizing. Some reported that the sound in the snowy forest resembled screaming spirits, ghosts of dead soldiers. Operating a Nebelwerfer was dangerous work that demanded courage, discipline, and speed. A typical crew consisted of 5 men, 1 gunner who aimed and fired, and 4 loaders who handled the heavy 75-pound rockets. The procedure was methodical but constantly perilous. Tow the launcher into position, typically at night to avoid aerial detection. Roads had to be avoided as much as possible. Allied reconnaissance aircraft constantly surveilled. Unhitch from the towing vehicle in silence. Camouflage the position with branches, camouflage nets, anything available. Crews became experts in concealment. Wait for the fire mission, sometimes for hours in freezing cold or stifling heat. This waiting was nerve-wracking. The men knew that the moment they fired, they would become priority targets. Load 6 rockets physically demanding work. 75 pounds might not seem enormous, but lift that weight repeatedly, insert it into angled tubes, connect electrical systems, all while knowing hundreds of enemy artillerymen are waiting for your mistake. Aim using simple mechanical sights. No sophistication here, just basic calculations and experience. Connect the electrical firing system with hands that might be trembling slightly. The crew takes cover away from the backblast, but close enough to act quickly. The gunner turns the handle. The 6 rockets launch in sequence. 10 seconds of pure firepower. Then begins the race against death. Immediately begin breakdown for movement. Every second counts now. Somewhere, radar operators are tracking the arc of your rockets. Artillerymen are calculating your position. Guns are pivoting in your direction. 90 seconds. That's all the time you have. 90 seconds to disconnect systems, attach the launcher to the vehicle, start moving. Many Nebelwerfer crews were killed not by enemy infantry in close combat, but by Allied artillery, methodically responding to their firing positions. Modern counter-battery fire was relentless and precise. Exact production figures vary by historical source, but estimates converge on impressive numbers that testify to this weapon's strategic importance. Over 5,715 centimeters Nebelwerfer 41 units were produced, the base model that defined the category. Over 321 cm Nebelwerfer 42 units, those heavier monsters designed for maximum destructive power. Several 128 centimeters and 32 centimeters systems, the disposable frame variants used for specific destruction missions. Over 300 Panzerwerfer 42 armored vehicles, combining mobility and firepower, and millions of rockets of different types, anti-tank, explosive, smoke, incendiary. Production continued until the last days of the war, even as Allied bombs reduced German factories to ruins. Even as Germany's industrial capacity collapsed, as raw materials became scarce, as skilled workers were transferred to the front, Nebelwerfer production remained an absolute priority. It was eloquent testimony to the weapon's effectiveness. Dying Germany devoted its dwindling resources to continuing production. The Nebelwerfer profoundly influenced rocket artillery development worldwide for decades to come. The Soviet Katyusha, technically predating the Nebelwerfer but having evolved in parallel on the same theatre of war, was a truck-mounted multiple rocket launcher. With larger salvos of 16 to 48 rockets, it created similar psychological impact. German soldiers feared the Stalin's organ as much as the Allies feared the Nebelwerfer. The American M4 and M17 multiple rocket launchers were a direct response to traumatic encounters with the Nebelwerfer. Mounted on tank chassis with an impressive capacity of 60 rockets, these systems represented American determination never to be outmatched in this weapon category. Modern systems continue this lineage. The Russian BM-21 Grad, used in conflicts across the world. The American M270 MLRS, a sophisticated platform capable of precision long-range fire. The Chinese Type 63 and its variants, all trace a direct conceptual lineage to weapons like the Nebelwerfer. The principle remains identical: rapid saturation of a target area with multiple simultaneous impacts. Perhaps the most enduring and troubling legacy is found in the testimonies of veterans who survived. Decades after the war, in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, survivors still describe Nebelwerfer's scream with visceral details that made their voices tremble. This sound appears in memoirs, oral histories, recorded interviews with remarkable and troubling consistency. Men who had forgotten other details of the war, who could no longer remember the names of their fallen comrades, remembered that scream with perfect clarity. A veteran, interviewed in 1995 at age 75, 50 years after the war's end, said in a voice that still carried the echo of that ancient terror, "I can still hear it. 50 years later, I can close my eyes and hear that sound perfectly, as if it were yesterday. We called it Screaming Mimi. Some guys called it Moaning Minnie. Didn't matter what you called it when you heard it, your guts turned to ice water." The Germans knew what they were doing with that sound. They knew exactly what they were doing. This testimony is not unique. It's repeated in hundreds of interviews, in dozens of memoirs. Thousands of men who survived the war carried that sound with them for the rest of their lives. It haunted their dreams. It returned in unexpected moments: a train whistle, the howl of wind, any high-pitched sound could instantly transport them back to those trenches, those forests, those moments of pure terror when the sky itself seemed to scream. The Nebelwerfer taught military planners several enduring lessons that continue to influence weapons design today. First, psychological impact can equal or even exceed physical destruction. The weapon's terror value often exceeded its actual casualty count. It wasn't simply a question of how many men were killed by fragmentation and explosion. But how many men were psychologically broken, rendered unable to fight effectively for hours or days? Second, rate of fire matters enormously. Saturating a target quickly prevents enemy response and maximizes the element of surprise. 6 rockets in 10 seconds created a shock that couldn't be replicated by conventional artillery firing sequentially. Simplicity aids mass production. The Nebelwerfer's relatively simple design allowed continuous production even as German industry collapsed under Allied bombing. No complex electronics, no precision parts impossible to manufacture, just metal, wood, and basic ballistic principles. Fourth, mobility equals survival. Static weapons became coffins in modern warfare, with counter-battery radar and air superiority. Shoot and scoot tactics were essential. Crews who remained in place died. Fifth, sound can be weaponized. The Nebelwerfer's acoustic properties were deliberately designed for maximum psychological effect. This wasn't an accidental byproduct, it was an intentional feature, carefully calibrated by engineers who understood that war was fought as much in the mind as on the battlefield. The Nebelwerfer remains a symbol of World War II, not just as a weapon, but as an embodiment of how psychological terror can be systematically designed and deployed. Its scream still resonates in collective memory, a reminder that sometimes, in war, what you hear can be as deadly as what hits you. When Nazi Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the Nebelwerfer didn't simply disappear into history. The weapon's influence rippled outward, shaping conflicts and military thinking for decades to come. Soviet forces, advancing through Eastern Europe, captured hundreds of Nebelwerfer launchers and thousands of rockets. They didn't destroy them. They studied them, reverse-engineered them, and integrated the lessons learned into their own rocket artillery doctrine. The experience of facing German Nebelwerfers on the Eastern Front had taught Soviet commanders the devastating effectiveness of massed rocket fire. By the late 1940 seconds, Soviet weapons designers had created improved versions of their Katyusha systems, incorporating elements of German Nebelwerfer design philosophy. The emphasis on psychological impact through acoustic engineering became standard Soviet doctrine. If the sound terrified German soldiers, it would terrify NATO forces. American ordnance officers conducted exhaustive tests on captured Nebelwerfers at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the same facility where the bazooka had been tested just years earlier. Engineers fired captured rockets, measured acoustic signatures, analyzed the psychological effects documented in after-action reports from hundreds of engagements. The conclusion was unanimous. The Germans had weaponized fear itself. June 1950. North Korean forces swept across the 38th parallel, equipped with Soviet weapons and Soviet doctrine. Among their arsenal were BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers, descendants of the same weapon family that had evolved alongside the Nebelwerfer. American soldiers fighting in the Korean hills heard a sound eerily reminiscent of what their fathers and older brothers had described from European battlefields. The rising scream, the psychological paralysis, the urge to run even when there was nowhere to go. Sergeant James McKinley, a World War II veteran who had faced Nebelwerfers in the Ardennes, found himself under Katyusha fire near the Pusan perimeter in August 1950. In a 1987 interview, he recalled, "It wasn't exactly the same sound, but it was close enough. That rising scream that gets into your bones. I was 28 years old in Korea, not the scared 9-year-old kid I'd been in Belgium, but I still felt my stomach turn over when I heard it. You never forget that sound. Your body remembers even when your mind wants to forget." The Korean War demonstrated that the Nebelwerfer's lessons had been learned by military forces worldwide. Massed rocket artillery became standard equipment for modern armies, not despite its psychological impact, but because of it. By the 1960 seconds, North Vietnamese forces were using Soviet-supplied rocket artillery against American positions. The 122mm BM-21 Grad, a direct descendant of the Katyusha, which itself had evolved in parallel with the Nebelwerfer, became one of the most feared weapons of the Vietnam War. American firebase commanders developed the same countermeasures Allied forces had pioneered against the Nebelwerfer 20 years earlier: counter-battery radar, rapid response artillery, and aggressive patrolling to locate and destroy launch sites before they could fire. The psychological preparation also continued. Training officers would play recordings of rocket artillery fire to new troops, familiarizing them with the sound before they encountered it in combat. The same principle veterans had taught recruits in 1944. If you can hear it screaming, you're still alive. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, who served as an artillery officer in Vietnam, wrote in his 1975 memoir, "We studied World War II after-action reports extensively, particularly German use of Nebelwerfers and Soviet use of Katyushas. The psychological warfare aspect was considered as important as the physical destructive capability. We knew we weren't just fighting explosives, we were fighting fear." Today, multiple rocket launcher systems are standard equipment for every major military force on Earth. The American M270 MLRS can fire 12 227mm rockets in under a minute, each rocket capable of dispersing hundreds of submunitions over an area the size of several football fields. The Russian BM-30 Smerch can fire 12 300mm rockets with a range of over 70 kilometers. These modern systems are vastly more sophisticated than the Nebelwerfer. They feature GPS guidance, programmable fuses, digital fire control systems, and the ability to fire and relocate in under 2 minutes. The technology has evolved exponentially, but the fundamental principle remains identical to what German engineers discovered in the 1930 seconds. Saturate a target area rapidly with multiple impacts, create maximum psychological disruption, and maintain mobility to survive counter-battery fire. Even the acoustic signature remains a consideration. Modern rocket artillery produces a distinctive sound, not the deliberately engineered scream of the Nebelwerfer, but still a rising roar that announces incoming death. Military psychologists continue to study the psychological impact of that sound on both friendly and enemy forces. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Nebelwerfer isn't found in weapons specifications or tactical doctrine, but in the lives of the men who survived its scream. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a clinical psychologist who worked with World War II veterans at the VA hospital in Boston during the 1970 seconds and 1980 seconds, documented what she called acoustic trauma syndrome in dozens of patients. Many were men who had experienced Nebelwerfer attacks. They would describe the sound with perfect clarity 40 years later, Morrison wrote in a 1982 medical journal. Some could barely remember the names of men they'd served with, couldn't recall specific dates or locations, but they remembered that scream in extraordinary detail. It had burned itself into their neural pathways. Certain sounds would trigger flashbacks, train whistles, industrial machinery, even children's playground screams. The brain had tagged that frequency pattern as life-threatening danger, and no amount of time could fully erase that association. John Patterson, a British veteran who faced Nebelwerfers at Monte Cassino, lived until 2003. In one of his final interviews, conducted when he was 82 years old, he said, "People ask what I remember most about the war. They expect me to talk about the fear of death, the loss of friends, the hardship. But what I remember most clearly, what still wakes me up sometimes at night, is that bloody scream. The Germans were brilliant bastards. They didn't just build a weapon to kill us, they built a weapon to haunt us." The Nebelwerfer stands as perhaps the first weapon system where psychological impact was engineered as deliberately as ballistic performance. The 26 Venturi holes weren't an accident or a manufacturing defect, they were a conscious design choice to maximize terror. This represented a paradigm shift in military thinking. Previous weapons had psychological effects as byproducts. The Nebelwerfer had psychological effects as primary design features. Modern military doctrine has fully embraced this concept. Weapons designers now routinely consider psychological impact alongside kinetic effects. The sound of an A-10 Warthog's GAU-8 cannon, the distinctive crack of a Barrett, .50 caliber rifle, the roar of a tank's engine. These are all factored into weapons development and tactical employment. But it started with those German engineers in the 1930 seconds, experimenting with nozzle configurations in secret laboratories, searching for the perfect scream. The Nebelwerfer taught the world that in warfare, breaking the enemy's mind can be as effective as breaking their body. That lesson echoes through every conflict since 1941, from the frozen hills of Korea to the jungles of Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to modern conflicts across the globe. 6 rockets, 10 seconds. A scream that changed how humanity thinks about weapons and warfare. And 75 years after the last Nebelwerfer fired in anger, veterans still wake in the night, hearing that sound. The Nebelwerfer remains one of World War II's most psychologically effective weapons. It wasn't the most accurate, it wasn't the longest ranged. It wasn't the most powerful in terms of pure explosive weight, but it was terrifying. That scream, that deliberate cry, designed with malicious intent, entered men's heads and stayed there forever. It broke morale, it induced panic, it made experienced soldiers, veterans hardened by years of combat, want to flee even when their training and discipline told them to hold firm. The Germans understood something crucial that other armies took longer to grasp. In war, breaking your enemy's will can be as important as breaking their forces. The Nebelwerfer accomplished both simultaneously. From its deceptive origins as a simple smoke mortar, officially permitted under the Treaty of Versailles, to its evolution into multiple deadly variants, from its devastating debut on the Eastern Front to its use in every theatre where German forces fought, the Nebelwerfer transformed how military planners thought about rocket artillery. 6 rockets, 10 seconds. A sound that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. This weapon proved that effective innovation doesn't always require maximum complexity or the most advanced technology. Sometimes, the most direct solution, simple tubes, solid fuel rockets, and a deep understanding of human psychology, can have a disproportionate impact on the course of war. The Nebelwerfer also represents a turning point in understanding psychological warfare. Before this weapon, few armament designers systematically thought about how a weapon's sound could be intentionally designed to maximize terror. After the Nebelwerfer, this consideration became standard in weapons development. This weapon's legacy still resonates today in every modern multiple rocket launcher system. The principles remain identical: rapid saturation, psychological impact, mobility for survival. Technologies have evolved: electronic guidance, improved precision rockets, sophisticated targeting systems, but the fundamental concept comes directly from the Nebelwerfer. The next time you hear about multiple rocket launcher systems, the American MLRS, the Russian Grad, the historic Katyusha, remember where it all began. Remember the German engineers who discovered that sometimes the sound of death is as powerful as death itself. Remember the soldiers in frozen trenches, in dense forests, in urban ruins, who heard that rising scream and knew hell was descending upon them. Remember the crews who risked their lives with every salvo, knowing that firing their weapon marked them for a deadly response. Remember that war is measured not only in casualties and conquered territories, but also in broken wills and haunted spirits. Remember Screaming Mimi, the scream that changed modern warfare forever. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.